Welcome back to Saturday series. You can tell I'm in a new location. I'm working in my office at UVA today, so it feels nice to be back in the office in a new place. So today we are going to be talking about biodiversity, and you might not know what that word means, but you will certainly know what it means by the time we're done with today's lesson. After I walk you through the lesson, you will follow the steps for the project, which is a really awesome stone painting project where you will paint preferably a native species, a species that lives in Virginia, on that rock, and place it somewhere maybe in your yard or somewhere in your neighborhood, and other people can enjoy it too. So what we're going to do today in terms of the lesson is we are going to talk about what biodiversity is. How does biodiversity change from place to place? How might it be different here in Charlottesville compared to like Washington, D.C., or maybe we'll pick another location, or like Virginia Beach. And we'll also think about some native species in Virginia, and how human activity and climate change is impacting biodiversity. So for part one, if you're looking at the lesson, there's some images that I'll refer to. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is really every living thing that includes plants, bacteria, fungi like mushrooms, and animals. And this term biodiversity is all the living things that live in a particular environment, space, or the variability, the differences between individual species. So we can think about biodiversity on genetic levels, on species levels, and ecosystem levels, and we'll talk about what all of those mean. And often, like I gave the example of different places around Charlottesville, Virginia Beach, and Washington, D.C., often this is biodiversity refers to all the living things that live in a particular area, or some smaller group of living things that live in a particular area. So genetic biodiversity is the diversity within an individual species. So how different is this critter from this critter, but they are both of the same species. So really looking at the genetic level and thinking about the biology of those species and how they might have adapted, changed their biology and their behaviors for any particular environment. And so one example is that this bear that I'm showing you, a sun bear, that can be found in a number of different countries, India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, right? And these are places that are separated. Most of these places are separated by ocean. So these sun bears have adapted to their particular environments in a little bit different ways. And so there are people who study how sun bears in one particular location, let's just say Indonesia, might be different than sun bears in Thailand. And what researchers have found for sun bears is that they are really, really sensitive to how much farmland exists in their habitat, which is just another word for where those sun bears live, so the environment that they live in. And also going along with that, right, so how much farmland exists, but how many people live in the area, which can be related to how much farmland exists in a given place. So genetic biodiversity is the diversity, the variability, the differences between species. And if we look at species biodiversity, it's sort of the next step, next level up in terms of thinking about biodiversity. And so this is the measure of variety of a species, not a species, of species within a particular genus. And so genus is just another classification for living things, right? And if you look at image 2, you see that sort of rainbow colored triangle. So if we look at the bottom, we're talking about species. So that's really the smallest classification of animals, of all, not just animals, of all living things. And there are, within a genus, there are usually multiple different types of species. And so how do species within the same genus vary? And one example would be that there are cicadas that live in the ground for the majority of their lives, and then they emerge every 13 or 17 years, depending on the species. And so there are multiple species of cicada that have this behavior where they live in the ground and then they pop out of the ground in large groups every 13 to 17 years. And so we can think about how these cicadas, different species of cicadas, are different from each other. And this is actually pretty relevant for what's happening now in this part of the United States, where a group or a brood of cicadas is currently emerging from the ground. They are 17-year cicadas. So the last time they busted out of the ground was 17 years ago, and now they are doing it again. And so I put an article in here that if your parents want to help you follow that link and read that article, there are some pictures in there too that are really interesting. And the article talks about these types of cicadas that you might see in the coming days here in Charlottesville. And they actually benefit the forest ecosystem, which is the next term that we will talk about. Okay, so ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems within a defined area. And an ecosystem are just groups of or collections of animals, plants, bacteria, and fungi that live in the same sort of physical environment. And so a physical environment would be like the Rivanna River. And so we can think about how different species interact or don't interact with each other, and how those species might serve different roles in their ecosystem. And so this is sort of the largest level of biodiversity, is at the ecosystem level, where now you're looking at multiple species, multiple classifications, even kingdoms. If you go back to look at image 2, a kingdom is higher up in the classification system. And these ecosystems can produce a huge range of different these ecosystems can live in a huge range of environments, and that can depend on, right, like what is the soil like? We talked about soil in one of the Saturday series lessons. What is the geology like? And that could be, right, like what is the rock composition? Are there streams? Are there certain types of features like mountains that can influence different ecosystems? And so really all of the stuff that you see in a across the land and even in the ocean, right, that those physical components of the environment can influence ecosystems, and maybe more some ecosystems more than others. And so I've shown in image 1, a forest and river ecosystem. Actually, this is from British Columbia, but could be, similar to forest and river ecosystems here in Virginia, where if you zoom into that image, you can see that there are a number of different living creatures in that environment. Then you can also see different parts of the physical environment as well. And so if we think about biodiversity and how it might change across the planet and then here in Virginia, we really have to understand what controls biodiversity. And so we know that biodiversity is not the same everywhere, right? Not every place is going to have the same amount of genetic species or ecosystem biodiversity or variations within the living things in different environments. But we do know that in places near the equator, and in image 3 you can see a map with different colors and a line for the equator. The red colors that you see are places where biodiversity is high, so that means that there's more genetic, more species, and more ecosystem variety of living things in those environments. And then as you move to the poles, remember we talked about, for the first Saturday series workshop, we talked about aurora and how we can see that at or near the North Pole, which would be at the top of the map, and then the South Pole, which would be at the bottom of the map. And so we can see that that starting at the equator and then either moving up to the North Pole or down to the South Pole on the map, that biodiversity decreases. And so blues are where biodiversity is really the lowest. And so a huge control on biodiversity, right, is temperature. And so temperatures are nice and warm around the equator. And as you move closer to the poles, they drop off. Also, what we can see is that that in places where there are deserts, so look at the northern part of Africa. If you're not sure which continent is Africa, you can pause me and ask one of the adults or older siblings around you. And so water is also important. Deserts don't have a lot of water, and actually that's one of the defining factors that determines if a place is a desert or not, is by the presence of water. And so just looking at this map, we can tell a lot about biodiversity. And one thing that is really incredible is that less than 10% of Earth's surface is at or around the equator, but the species that live around the equator make up about 90% of the world's species. So that's just an incredible amount of biodiversity at the equator. Okay, and what this map does not show is what's happening in the ocean. There is incredible biodiversity in the ocean, and generally biodiversity, right, the more genetic species and ecosystem variety of the living things in those environments, usually that's greater in the oceans close to continents, where there are a lot of nutrients, right? So you think of nutrients as like vitamins. If any of you take vitamins, that's essentially what a nutrient is. And so in the ocean, nutrients tend to come from either dust that comes from land and is blown into the ocean, or from rivers that are dumping water and broken pieces of rock or sediments into the ocean that act as those vitamins for the organisms that live in the ocean. So now thinking about Virginia, right, we know that this state that we live in is home to both the coast, lots of rivers and streams, and also mountains. And so this provides a lot of different what we call landscapes for ecosystems to live in and to thrive. Just to give you an idea of how many rivers exist in Virginia, if you add up the length of all of the rivers in Virginia, that equals almost 50,000 miles of rivers in this state alone. And so rivers are a really important environment for ecosystems here in Virginia. And some of you may have been fishing in Virginia rivers, or know people who have or do go fishing in rivers in Virginia. And so there are a lot of fish that live in Virginia. And I put a link to a website where you can see a lot of the different animals and fish that live here in Virginia. Okay, so if we think about where biodiversity would be greater, not at the sort of planet or global scale as we saw in that colorful map, but if we think about sort of how biodiversity might vary depending on where there are humans and what humans are doing, we tend to see that there's more biodiversity in areas that are uninterrupted by roads and buildings and farmland, right? So more natural landscapes. But that doesn't mean that you can't find different species and different ecosystems. Essentially, that it doesn't mean that you can't find biodiversity in urban areas. So urban is just a word for sort of human-built environments. And so if you are looking out a window here in Charlottesville, you might see animals like birds, and we'll talk about birds in a minute. Remember, we talked about soil in one of the Saturday series lessons, right, we know that there's a huge ecosystem and a lot of biodiversity in soils, which could be, right, bacteria, it could be worms, all the way to mushrooms that are either growing in the soil or growing on trees. If the weather is nice when you are going through this lesson and watching this video, I suggest that you pause me and you head outside to try to find at least 2 different types of birds. Try to remember the size of those birds. You don't need to, you can't measure those birds because likely they're not going to let you get close enough to measure them, and certainly if they're flying in the air, you won't be able to do that. But just remember, are they a size smaller than like a baseball? Are they about softball size? You might even see some that are larger, like basketball or soccer ball size. So try to remember what they look like and about what size they are. If they made any noises, try to remember what those noises sounded like. And then, so here would be a point to pause me. When you come back, you can try to go to this website here, the Audubon website, and try to figure out what birds you saw. So this is a really nice website. You can search birds by region. So when you go to the website, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see a box that has region written in it, and you'll go to Southeast. We are in the southeast part of the United States, and that will bring up birds that are commonly seen in the Southeast, including Virginia. So try to find what birds you saw, and you can click on the bottom right of those beautiful drawings to hear what sounds those birds make, and so that might help you find the birds that you saw as well. So have fun doing that. Now that we talked a little bit about this human and non-human ecosystem relationships, right? Like there's more biodiversity where there are less roads and farmland and stuff like that. You can imagine that human activity in a number of ways can influence biodiversity. So biodiversity has always been impacted by natural hazards, we call them, like fires, floods, storms, and natural climate changes. Other events like volcanic eruptions and asteroids are also important in biodiversity in any given location. But many of the changes that are occurring on our planet in terms of making more urban human-built areas, more farmland to sustain growing human populations, and our long-term choice of energy use being fossil fuels, and an impact on climate change has really been leading to changes in environments that are happening too quickly for species to learn those changes and to adapt to the new environments or changing environments. As humans are altering the land, right, we're also altering or removing habitats for different species to live in. And so in regions where there are nature preserves, right, we have some nature preserves in Charlottesville and around Charlottesville. These are places that are really preserved from not human activity, but from taking down trees and shrubs that are habitats for other species to live in. And so you might see, if you go to places in Charlottesville, like one nature preserve is Ivy Creek. If you go there, you might see more birds or more species of dragonflies than you would in places like around any of the Harris Teeter grocery stores in Charlottesville. Okay, so there's a really, really great video that I suggest you all watch, and it talks about a lot about what is covered in the written lesson and this recording. So check out that video. It talks about biodiversity in places like Colorado, Hawaii, and Australia. So watch that video before moving on to part 4, when we walk you through painting your stones.